All right, so this is going to be a very applied paper. Basically, what I want to do is test Kant's theory and utilitarianism and see how they can handle some of the ethical decisions we're making around vaccine distribution and triaging during COVID. And what I'm going to claim is that our way of approaching these issues and the ethical principles that we're using sort of stretches both Kant and utilitarianism, sort of the breaking point, and pushes us to develop some kind of hybrid theory. So it's kind of taking our way of thinking in these issues and using them through the process of reflective equilibrium to test and maybe transform a couple of the major moral theories, including Kant's. Now, most of you know, maybe you don't, Beauchamp and Childress' Principalism. This is the moral theory, if you want to call it that most medical professionals are using and that most people are using in triage committees. It tries to incorporate a few different moral principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And one of the things to note there is that they don't give any sort of algorithm for how to weigh these against one another. In some cases, we'll want to emphasize autonomy. In other cases, we'll want to focus on other things. So, for example, when resources are sufficient, we tend to focus on our duties to individual patients, including respecting their autonomy and promoting their well-being, giving them equal access to the care they need. But when resources are scarce, providers ought to maximize overall benefits to the community. And this may involve prioritizing some patients over others. And that's what we have to do in this case. In some cases, then we have to decide who lives and who dies. They talk about beneficence not only in terms of individual patients, but in terms of the community and maximizing benefit to the community. Now, during COVID, we have these two issues that I mentioned before. When there are scarce medical resources, we have to decide both how to allocate them for treatment. This is the triage process. That is, when people come to the hospital and they have difficulty breathing and they're suffering from COVID, how are we supposed to allocate things like ICU beds? How are we supposed to allocate respirators and intensive care nurses? And then we also have to think about how to distribute the vaccines. Now, when we're talking about triaging, we look at typically short-term prospects and long-term prospects. Now, that means what we want is patients who are more likely to survive the treatment, who need the treatment in order to survive, but who are likely to survive it. In the short term, that's usually defined as surviving to discharge from the hospital. And that's sort of a whole life criterion in the sense that what we want to do is maximize the number of people who leave the hospital. But we also, when we're making triage decisions, have to look at the long-term prospects. And that's usually defined as 5 years past discharge. And this is where we look at comorbidities to determine how likely they are to live, not only to discharge, but also an extended period past discharge. What we do then in triaging is to prioritize the people who are most likely to survive. That means deprioritizing people with comorbid conditions, and in some cases, people who are older. And the reason for that is it's been shown with COVID-19 that age is an independent risk factor. For every year older you are, there's some percentage that you're more likely to die from it once you get it. With vaccine distribution, it's a little different. In that case, you're also still trying to help the most people to survive, but in that case, you're trying to give it to people and prioritize people who are most at risk. And in that case, then you would prioritize the elderly and people with comorbid conditions, because if they get it, they're more likely to die. So it sort of flips, but in both cases, the same principles hold. You're trying to save the most lives and to maximize life years. If you look at how frontline healthcare workers are treated in these things, different people have different opinions about how they should be triaged. Some people said you should not prioritize them because they won't be able to get out on the front lines front lines and help the pandemic response. Other people said that they should be prioritized because they'll get back out and be able to help with the response. But everyone agrees that they should be prioritized for vaccine distribution so that they can remain there to help people get the care they need. All right, so let me talk about Kant then for a bit. I won't go into too much detail on explaining Kant's duty of beneficence because I assume that everyone who's on this call knows plenty about it. But I will say first, to kind of address a possible objection, one question that might be raised is it really a duty of beneficence? Is this really a moral obligation? Is this a government operation that involves something more like distributive justice? To that, I just have to say, look, the thing I'm most interested in is this decision process and what we should be weighing. You can imagine then if you think the government doesn't have these sorts of obligations, you can imagine a non-governmental organization doing it or an individual philanthropist. It's actually, in fact, the case that most of these vaccine distribution guidelines and the triage algorithms are being developed in ethics committees. So even though they're working for the state, these are very much ethical considerations that are being made. Now, as I say, you're all familiar with Kant's view on beneficence. Now, as you know, he ruled out non-beneficence as a maxim. I think that a maxim of non-beneficence would be something like a lottery system, where you would say, all right, I'm not going to jump ahead of anyone in the queue to get my vaccine, but if I get ahead of someone who needs it more, that's their business, So I don't think that sort of thing would be justified. What we need with beneficence is to actively try to help people. But what that means, what actively and effectively trying to help someone means, is an open question. As you all know, it's an imperfect duty, so it doesn't obligate me to support any particular person or further any specific aims, but to promote their happiness. So the question I'm asking is, what does that amount to when we're talking about triage decisions and vaccine distribution? So I'm just going to read a bit of my talk here at this point. So Kant at this point differs from utilitarianism in a couple of major related ways. First, the rightness of my action doesn't depend on whether I, in fact, increase others' happiness. So you're all familiar with that idea, right? A goodwill is not good because of what it affects or accomplishes. But second, I'm not morally obligated to maximize the ends achieved, right? So although a person who's more charitable is more, or maybe more virtuous, their level of charitableness is not measured by how efficiently they use their limited resources. Okay, so this is a quote from Wood. He says, there is not more merit per se in making two people happy rather than one, or in making one person twice as pleased as you might have. And you can also think about the stuff that's been written on, do the numbers count and things like that. Now, the fact that beneficence is an imperfect duty, though, doesn't mean that there's no standard for how helpful an agent should be. So although a goodwill is not good because of what it affects or accomplishes, Kant's also clear that willing is not a mere wish, but is the summoning of all means insofar as they are in our control. You're all familiar with that. And the Tugendlehre, Kant says that rich people have an obligation to be beneficent in a way that poor people don't, precisely because of the means they have at their disposal. So poor people don't need to make themselves destitute in trying to help others, and rich people have, as he says, the resources to practice such beneficence as depends on the goods of fortune. So if someone's efforts are bound to be ineffective or they fail to achieve a net increase in happiness because they make the charitable person poor enough to be in need of help themselves, then they're not obligated to be beneficent. Now, if someone can effectively help others because of their resources, knowledge, or abilities, then they have some obligation to do so in accordance with the means at their disposal. So, for example, someone who can afford it and who contributes money to a grossly inefficient charity is arguably not acting beneficently at all, right? In such a case, the person's maxim is not, when I can afford it, I'll help those in need. It's something more like, when I can afford it, I will give to an organization that professes to help those in need. Because the person could easily find out how effective the charity is, there are all sorts of websites with this information. and these are some of the means in our control. The action is more properly described as supporting a charity's bureaucracy rather than helping the less fortunate. So an effort must be made to have an impact on others relative to the resources one has and the knowledge they have or could have about how best to use them. Now, regarding COVID-19, the random distribution of vaccines or a lottery for patients in need of treatment would achieve some good, but would also produce a lot of bad outcomes, including people who would die or suffer unnecessarily. So treating the elderly and people with comorbidities ahead of younger, healthier people would save lives, but overall it would save fewer lives than treating those who are more likely to survive to discharge. Now, younger people also tend to have better long-term prospects, so not prioritizing them would amount to sacrificing life years, understood in Kantian terms as additional capacity for rational end setting. I'll just note just offhandedly that I am simplifying things a little bit. There are cases where older people would be prioritized over younger people and things like that, but just in general. On the other hand, vaccinating young, otherwise healthy people who are less likely to die from the disease, that would promote their capacity to set and pursue ends, but little more than doing nothing. Their inoculation would also be at the expense of others, such as the elderly, who are more likely to die if they're infected. In a worst case scenario, no lives would be saved if the young people who are vaccinated would have only gotten mild symptoms, and many preventable deaths would be allowed to happen if the older people who are not vaccinated would otherwise have lived. So if the net happiness produced is less than zero, and we have reason to believe that it would be less than zero, then our helpful intentions seem like mere wishes rather than willing the maxim of beneficence. The duty to promote the happiness of other rational beings thus imposes an obligation on us to try to be effective, though it's unclear just how much someone would have to try. If no one was helped because of as Kant says, a special disfavor of fortune, or by the niggardly provision of a stepmotherly nature, rather than because of a lack of effort, then the action would still be morally praiseworthy. Furthermore, if no one expects perfect knowledge of how most effectively to help others. Instead, the agent would have to take reasonable efforts, however we define that, to help people as best they can. Now, this is not significantly different at this point than some brands of utilitarianism. Mill judges an action based on its actual consequences, and Kant rejects that. And he also says that the agent is judged separately based on the altruistic character and how earnestly they attempt to help, which is not too far from Kant in some readings. And some versions of utilitarianism approve of actions that do not optimally increase the aggregate amount of happiness. So according to Michael Sloat's satisficing consequentialism, for example, less than maximally good consequences are preferred when other valuable moral ends can be achieved. The outcome only has to be good enough under the circumstances. Now, at this point, I think when we start talking about effectiveness, Kant's deontological ethics becomes functionally equivalent to utilitarianism. And by functionally equivalent, I mean that although the foundational justifications of the two approaches are different, one values happiness, while the other values rational willing, their basic reasoning and its implications are the same, or at least very similar. By considering people in the aggregate, the utilitarian is not considering happiness per se when it tries to maximize life saved, but the capacity to pursue happiness. So for example, triage committees don't consider the relative happiness of individual COVID patients, or how many family members they have, or their contributions to society. In maximizing lives and life years, they're considering their preference to continue living and to have a chance at pursuing good experiences. Now, similarly, in considering people's capacity to set ends, Kant's concerned with preserving life. Now, although they're considered as rational agents rather than merely sentient beings who feel pleasure and pain or have preferences, rational end setting includes the pursuit of happiness, which is, as Kant says, the natural end that all human beings have. Now, the difference between valuing agents who can pursue their happiness and valuing agents who can pursue any end whatsoever, including happiness, is slight, and in this case, the implications are nearly identical. As R.M. Hare says, treating other people's ends as my own is the same as doing what is conducive to satisfying people's rational preferences. Now, although taking Kant in this direction better accommodates the distribution principles we've adopted during the pandemic, it comes at the cost of turning his theory inside out. If consequences are relevant for determining whether an action is right, then it's in tension with Kant's claim that the goodness of a goodwill is independent of what's achieved by it. Prioritizing some people over others based on their health conditions moves from a commitment to the fundamental equality of humanity, devaluing people with more life years, and adopting a maximizing or satisficing principle as part of the duty of beneficence eschews the wide latitude normally afforded by imperfect duties. Now, one difference between utilitarianism and Kantian ethics is that for Kant, we owe things to individual persons, while Bentham and Mill value states of affairs. This is a common criticism of utilitarianism. If a large amount of happiness could be experienced by one person, then it would be more than a small amount of happiness for many people added together. In that case, the former situation is preferable. So as John Rawls puts it, the utilitarian is just concerned with the sum of advantages produced and not whether there's a just distribution. Now, with regard to triage decisions, a 30-year-old who has equivalent prospects as a 40-year-old would be prioritized simply because they're younger and have more years to live. There was this early recommendation by the Italian Society of Anesthesia, Analgesia, and Intensive Care that there be an age limit for admission to intensive care, regardless of comorbidities or likelihood of survival. And a lot of people did not like that because they saw it as an unjust allocation. It didn't treat people's lives as equally valuable. Seems like ageism, right? But if such a discriminatory policy would produce more good, in this case, maximizing more life years, then rule utilitarianism would seem to approve of it. Now, Kant's ethics seems well equipped to guard against such biases, right? If something becomes good by my setting it as an end to be pursued, then the capacity to set ends has absolute worth, as opposed to non-rational things which have relative value and is comparable to and interchangeable with other things. The inner worth that people have by virtue of their humanity gives them dignity. And if all rational beings have absolute value and none of them can be treated merely as a means, they have equal worth. So there's a value to saving whole lives that's separate from the value of saving life years. So for Kant, as opposed to the utilitarian, the value of lives can't be compared with one greater than the other by virtue of, say, their contributions to society. This happened in the so-called God Committee, which was the first ethics committee that was allocating dialysis machines in the early 1960s. Some of you may be familiar with this story. Among other selection criteria, they ranked people based on their social value, including their marital status, occupation, income, net worth, and educational background. And this basically reinforced the committee members' cultural biases. Now, for Kant, although we can compare ourselves more or less favorable to the moral law, depending on how virtuous we are, the moral value of any two rational beings, and thus our obligation to them as ends in themselves, is equivalent. So he says, all men are equal, and only he that is morally good has an inner worth superior to the rest. The inner worth of our character depends on our virtue, but the value of humanity, and thus our duty to respect others and ourselves, is constant across all people, regardless of how good they are. Now, of course, utilitarianism is committed to impartiality. The way Mill puts it is everybody to count for one, nobody for more than one. Thus, it assumes a kind of equality principle. The goal of maximizing aggregate happiness doesn't privilege any specific individual over another. This is the way in which it's agent neutral. So each person has equal standing to have their interests considered in the calculus. I can't give my preferences more weight in my own calculations even. But this is very different from what's entailed by Kant's formula of humanity. The implications of holding the utilitarian's principle of impartiality or equal consideration results in different treatment, since different people have different social value, different capacities for happiness, and different experiential outcomes, even in the same circumstances. Indeed, Mill says that all persons are deemed to have a right to equality of treatment, except when some recognized social expediency requires the reverse. Now, this is exactly the sort of reasoning that triage committees must engage in, right? Although no one is more worthy of getting treatment for COVID, the efforts to save people are more worthwhile because they're likely to save more lives or more life years. In times of scarcity, social expediency requires that people be treated unequally. Now, one could devise, so the idea here is that utilitarianism seems to privilege life years over lives. With Kant, I talked about a way that he seemed to privilege lives over life years, and a way that if we talked about effective helping, we could try to get something like that in there. With the utilitarian now, they seem to privilege life years over lives. But now I'm going to talk about how utilitarianism could maybe be stretched to have a consideration of lives equally. So you could devise a utilitarian argument for equal treatment rather than just equal consideration of interests. So according to rule utilitarianism, we should follow rules that tend to produce the greatest amount of happiness. And he famously defended, Mill did, free speech rights on utilitarian grounds, with the idea being that silencing unpopular speech would, on the whole and in the long run, produce worse outcomes, even if in a particular case, prohibiting the expression of a minority view would make the majority better off. Now, the rule utilitarian could, I think, give a similar justification of equal treatment in the distribution of scarce medical resources by appealing to long-term consequences. So, for example, to rule out ageism, the utilitarian could argue that we ought to repay older people's years-long social investment in improving society and contributing to its functioning with privileged access to treatment. The duty of gratitude may incentivize more long-term benefits for the community, among other things. In addition, the God Committee's consideration of marital status, occupation, and educational background may ignore a different kind of social value. This was a quote from someone at the time. They said, "This rules out creative nonconformists who rub the bourgeoisie the wrong way, but who historically have contributed so much to the making of America." Right? So broadly speaking, there may be greater social cohesion and trust if people don't feel like they're competing with others in order to live. Given that we also ought to maximize life years, which favors the young, conceivably these considerations of all the various incentives, preferences, and desire satisfactions could balance each other out, and we would arrive at a lottery system or some egalitarian system such as first come, first served. Now, such reasoning would upend the seemingly obvious utilitarian calculations that public health organizations are making now. In some cases, we would prioritize older people for treatment and younger people for vaccines, even though it would not maximize whole lives or life years saved. Now, at this point, then, rule utilitarianism becomes functionally equivalent to deontological ethics. Again, the foundational justifications of the theories are different. One should follow a rule either because doing so tends, on the whole, to maximize utility, that's Mill's approach, or because it's one's duty to do so regardless of the consequences, that's Kant's approach. But as J.J.C. Smart notes, if rule utilitarianism has us follow the rule, even if, in a given case, making an exception to the rule would in fact maximize utility, then it becomes a form of rule worship. So we ought to follow the rule because it's the rule, consequences be damned. So if, like Kant's formula of humanity, the rule has us give equal consideration to patients, regardless of age or social value, then both Mill and Kant are having us consider patients as persons with equal worth and are ignoring the different consequences of them living or dying, the latter of which should be relevant in any utilitarian calculus. So basically, what I'm trying to do is talk about how Kant, in his consideration of everyone's equality as people and equal value, does a really good job at handling the value of whole lives. But to get what we think of as a need to maximize life years, we have to really push this notion of effective helping, which turns him more or less into a utilitarian. I suggest in a longer version of this paper that Kant can really handle things pretty well in normal circumstances. Respecting the person's autonomy, helps limit us on human experimentation and providing people with basic health care and non-discrimination, things like that. The problem is, in times of scarcity, we have to make difficult decisions in which we prioritize some people over others. Now, Mill, by contrast, I think does a pretty good job of prioritizing some people over others, specifically based on maximizing life years, but he does a really bad job of justifying equal consideration and equal treatment. So how do we avoid using people merely as means? Now, one of the things I want to bring up here is this deliberative process by which public health officials have developed moral principles for triage and vaccine distribution is an example of the community undergoing a process of wide reflective equilibrium, in which it's not only testing moral beliefs against other beliefs and bedrock principles, that's narrow reflective equilibrium, but it's also testing general principles, in this case, Kantian and utilitarian principles, against our moral intuition. So, in ethics, sometimes a compelling moral theory should correct our intuitions. And sometimes, if the theory is wrong or inadequate on its own, our moral intuitions ought to correct the theory. In times of plenty, Kant's ethics and utilitarianism have similar enough implications that a choice doesn't need to be made between them. But in times of scarcity, it becomes clear that they lead in different directions. And if existing triage guidelines and vaccine protocols are accurate indicators of our moral intuitions, then the value given to both whole lives and life years seems to imply that neither Kant's ethics nor utilitarianism is sufficient on its own. So there was this recent empirical study by Margot Kulin et al., and this supports the idea that this is where our intuitions lie. Based on a series of deliberative workshops, they conclude that people have a triad of moral commitments. That's the way they put it. There's an equality principle that respects all people's equal worth, an efficiency principle that values saving the most lives, and a vulnerability principle that protects people who are socially disadvantaged. Now, although the researchers don't phrase it like this, people seem to be committed to utilitarian reasoning with Kantian guardrails in place, right? You want to protect the absolute value of persons. And these three principles also map closely onto the four principles of Beauchamp and Childress. Autonomy involves an equal respect for people's personhood. Beneficence and non-maleficence are concerned with promoting happiness and avoiding harm. And justice is meant to protect against unfair treatment. Now, I want to be very clear to say that none of this is trying to prove that, say, Kant or Mill is wrong. In such a brief paper, really, I can only suggest that the distribution of scarce medical resources poses a particular challenge to both of those theories, especially given the values that we seem to have taken on during the pandemic. Under the circumstances, defenders of these theories then have three choices. One is to say our intuitions are off, right? And we gotta change in order to make it line up with either Kantian ethics or utilitarianism. Or they could explain how one of these theories can actually accommodate all of these intuitions. Finally, they could say, look, we've got to adjust things and try a different approach, perhaps a kind of hybrid approach. Now, I think it would be too hasty to dismiss these intuitions since they're so widely shared and they've been informing a lot of our principles across the world, really, in how we distribute vaccines and triage COVID patients. So I think number one wouldn't be so good. Furthermore, as I showed, trying to accommodate those intuitions may require modifications to Kant's ethics and utilitarianism that flatly contradict the theory's basic principles. With Kant, you'd have to define beneficence in terms of maximization of outcomes, despite the non-comparative worth of rational beings and the wide latitude afforded imperfect duties. With utilitarianism, you'd have to transform it into a quasi-deontological rule worship. So that weighs against option two. Now, bringing our moral intuitions to bear on these traditional moral theories then gives us some sense of the values and obligations that any ethical theory would have to justify. Providers have a personal obligation not to discriminate, and communities have a collective obligation to treat people impartially. When necessary, for example, in times of scarcity, there must be a way to prioritize some people over others. Prioritization should maximize positive outcomes, both whole lives and the satisfaction of preferences, and it should result in a just distribution of goods. Kantianism, I suggest, is better equipped to justify equal treatment, the value of whole lives, and a concern for what's owed to individuals. Utilitarianism is better equipped to justify impartial consideration and unequal treatment, the value of happiness, and maximization of goods overall. So clearly, we value all these principles in our pandemic response. So our moral intuitions support both Kantianism in some ways and utilitarianism in others. And subjecting these theories to the process of reflective equilibrium thus supports the idea that neither theory is sufficient. Both are necessary, and we need to combine them somehow. Now, again, I don't have the time to do this, and certainly we could discuss this more in the Q&A in just a moment. But there are some people who have kind of suggested things down this line. Sissela Bach has done some work like this. Derek Parfit more recently with his triple theory, plus Beauchamp and Childress, who I mentioned earlier. Shelley Kagan, maybe, depending on how you read it, might be a move in this direction. But I guess what I'm suggesting is that applied ethics, especially in the case of distribution of scarce medical resources, can help us to test our theories and in some cases transform our theories. So this relates a lot, and I'm glad that Herta talked before I did what she said in her Q&A, and this is not to imply that she supports anything I just said. I'm not sure. But she mentioned that what Kant was trying to do was elucidate common morality. Applied ethics can help us to come back to our common morality, to think about how well it measures up in making sense of our deep moral intuitions, and to think about how we should proceed from there. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to hear any questions that you have.